today?
Good.
Great. Okay, so we're going to talk about poverty and brain development today. And let's see here. First, this is going to be our agenda. Who am I? I am Kim Graham. I'm a diagnostician for the district, and I serve Hurdy, Hackney, Garrett, Dunbar, Special Services, which is like our homebound kids, and I also do ECI, which is early childhood intervention, and then I'm child find, and I handle the lead on the team evaluations. So I do see a lot of, when I do the child find stuff, I always go out to the homes, so I see a lot of this poverty and stuff firsthand. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to talk about just poverty basics. I know this is something you probably already know, but just a refresher. And then actually taking a look at poverty in Lufkin ISD and how it relates to our district and what those statistics are. And then we're going to do a little activity, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty about how this poverty relate to brain development. Poverty and brain development, and then what can you do as teachers and how we can recognize those signs. But before we get started, I want to ask you, what do you think poverty looks like? Just before we get into it, what do you think it looks like? Or when you hear the word poverty, what do you think about?
Poverty, to me, it means like someone, or when someone doesn't have their basic needs met, without the control. Like, it's not because, it doesn't always have to be that the parent doesn't want to, but it's just they don't have the means.
They don't have the means, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily like neglect.
Neglect, no,
but it's
not
just
always.
They can't provide the basic needs,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Anything else you think? Like lack of food, hunger?
Educated, like not educated, uneducated.
Clothing.
Clothing, that's a big one. Like tattered, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of times you'll see kids that come to school and their clothes are either too small or too big because it's hand-me-downs. And this is what we're going to talk about, is how that affects these kids in the classroom, because all of those things play a role in how they're going to succeed in school. So let's see here. I'm going to start out with a little video. But just be keeping those things in mind as we go along.
Kids' uniforms we just have here already, so we just wake up in the morning, all the uniforms that we get, the school supplies, all the school supplies that we get. At first it was really uncomfortable, because we're like sardines packed in a little thing, but then you get a little used to it, but there's still like problems, like the toilet gets clogged up, or there's the clothes is like, it gets dirty and you have to keep washing. Like, we run out of food really quickly because there's a lot of us in here. Or it gets too hot, or we can't all fit in the car, or stuff like that. It's just like, there's too many people in a little space. It rains, well yeah, something's gonna get wet, or we all have to go inside there and it's like, oh, and then the mud and all that. It's gross. And, we'll get into the bus stop because we have to go all the way over there. We turn on the aircon because it's really hot in there. And we just leave it on. We get the blankets out of our truck. It's like a giant suitcase because it doesn't work. And we just lay them on the floor right there. We have to like sweep, and then we have to lay them on the floor. And then we have like a little foam mattress, and we put it right there. And we all me, I sleep there, he sleeps there. I sleep there, he sleeps there. The twins, they sleep on top of the bed with my mom. And then my baby brother sleeps there, the littlest one, he sleeps there on the floor with me. And these two, they sleep with my grandparents in that little space up there. So it's like, they sleep on the floor, but my grandparents sleep on the mattress. And sometimes
they sleep up on the floor.
And And sometimes like the floor's hard, so it feels uncomfortable when you get up, like you feel sore. But you still get up, but if you feel sore, it's like, and if you leave like a little bit of food, like the ants will come or something, and they'll start biting you, and then you have to get up, sleep again, put bleach or something so they can go away, and then you're just there, like all big and uncomfortable, and it just, yeah, it's not like normal, like we're not normal kids, but we do better than they're supposed to. Like,
What makes you do better?
well, I try. Like, I actually do try. Like, other kids, they nag and they...
The situation that we're in,
Yeah.
we try harder, so when we're older, we can go somewhere higher, at least not horrible, but it's something normal, better life than we know as young adults right now what we're living through, so when we're older, we think about it and actually fight for something that we want, which is something normal, a normal life, at least a little car to get us around. So we know we have to be successful, but the only way that is to being in school and passing the test, the grades, getting good grades, doing the best we can in school so our lives can be better in the future.
Okay. So, how did this video make you feel? Or what did that make? Did it make you change your opinion of like what poverty is?
Yes.
And sadly, this is stuff we see in our district. People live like this in our district. And how did these kids, one of the things that he said in here that was eye-opening to me is like, he maybe has to sleep on the floor and he wakes up sore, and how that the next day he has to come to school and he's feeling sore, or there's ants crawling if they leave a little bit of food on the ground. So, you know, they don't have one working vehicle. It's just, this is what these kids come from.
And like the weather too plays a big part in their day, how they're getting it to school. They might have clean clothes, but then getting to the bus, because it's muddy, or whatever reason, they might be delayed and not make it to school because of their electric or
Okay, so what is poverty? Poverty is defined as a person with less income than deemed sufficient to purchase their basic needs, like we already said, food, shelter, clothing, and other essentials. So if you're not able to purchase those things, then that's what poverty is defined. The official poverty thresholds are set by the Office of the Management and Budget. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the poverty threshold is $25,750 for a family of 4. So when you think about that, like we're all working class people, that's not a lot of money. And you think about how you live and how the things that you need weekly. So that's for a year. So just think about how many people that are living like that in our districts. And a lot of people actually have more than a family of 4. And of course that goes up is the more people that you have in the household. But just when you break that down like over the months and the weeks, that's not a lot of money. And just the cost of like groceries and different things like that. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so there's also different types of poverty. There's situational poverty and generational poverty. So the situational poverty is like if there's like a sudden crisis or loss. And what are some things that could be? Like loss of job.
Yeah.
A death. It could often be temporary. That's really hard though. Like I know that if you get behind on your bills, it's really hard to get caught up. Caught up, you have to get out and maybe get into your savings, that kind of thing. Environmental disasters, we've seen that firsthand here, like with the flooding in Houston or Katrina. People, their whole homes and lives are just uprooted and they have to move quickly because everything is flooded and gone. They have, especially people that don't have like family anywhere that they can go to, and they're just trying to survive. Divorce can often cause things like that if it's they're going through different households, like maybe the mom didn't work and the dad, it's a custody battle, that kind of thing. Health problems, a big one could be like cancer, or you have medical treatments, or even some kind of like accident that happened that would go into sudden crisis or loss. But you get in a car wreck and all these medical bills pile up, and it's causing this poverty. And then we also have generational poverty, and this is where like at least two generations of family have been born into poverty. And I always use the example, there's a neighborhood in this area that, you know, they just live in poverty, and that's just what they know. And that's just their norm. So they're not equipped with the tools to move out of their situations. They've never been able to further their education, or they don't see the needs in it. And if you try to talk to them about it, they don't want to, because that's what they know. They live like that. So there's these two different types of poverty. I feel like situational is probably more, obviously going to be more temporary, and the generational is just a repetitive pattern that's going to happen. So actually, these are statistics in Lufkin ISD. We have 8,176 students in the district, and that was taken from the 2017 Texas Education Agency snapshot. 77.8% are economically disadvantaged. So that is a lot. And that, again, that was taken directly from the 2017 Texas Education Agency snapshot. Now this number comes from the kids that qualify for free or reduced lunch. So if you did the math on that, that's going to be a lot of kids that qualify for that. And they have to qualify based on income. So obviously their incomes are falling below that threshold. Now, I talked with the Lufkin ISD social worker, and we have just last year, we had 624 students that were considered homeless or in foster care. And there's some definitions that go along with that, and that comes from the McKinney-Vento Act. And the definition of homelessness means an individual who has a lack of a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. That includes children that are like sharing a home, that's what we call doubled up. Children that are, their nighttime residence is in a public place, and that could be like accommodation, a park, or even a car. Children that are living in public housing, abandoned buildings, bus or train stations, anything like that. And I have the broken down statistics for those. So again, like I said, 624 are considered homeless or in foster care. So out of those last year, we had 39 living in shelters, and that's, you know, the Women's Crisis Center, the homeless shelter, those kind of things. 39 children living there. Transitional, we had 7 children in those types of settings, and that's like a halfway house, or the crisis center also provides housing. They're not living at the shelter, but they don't own the home themselves. They're just kind of transitioning out of the shelter. Doubled up was 491. And again, that is if they've had their specific definition for that, and that is if an individual may be considered homeless if they're doubled up. And that refers to a situation where individuals are unable to maintain their housing and are forced to stay with friends or extended family members. This could also be like if a parent's released from prison and they don't have anywhere to go, or a hospital, they don't have stable housing. So the majority of this number is kids that are doubled up, so they might not be living in such a bad place, they just don't have a residence. This is what really hit home to me. We had 6 kids in unsheltered places. Even though we have 8,000 children, 6 of those kids were either living in like a park or a car, or it could be a home that's not fit to live in, which would be like they didn't have a complete roof, they didn't have running water, that kind of thing. That's sad that we even have one. You know, and I know that Ms. Akers is very involved with those kids to help with the assistance in that area. We had 18 living in a motel. You know, and if you know anything about the motels that they live in, there's a lot of prostitution that they see and things like that, and that's why they're living there. So, you know, of course, I'm not stereotyping that, but that could be the issue. And then 63 kids in foster care. Again, of course, if they're in foster care, most likely they're being taken care of and not, you know, they're getting government assistance, but again, we count that number. So just think about that. That's a lot. And so what we're getting into the nitty-gritty is this is the kids that you're educating. This is the kids that are coming through your classrooms. So we want to figure out the best way to support them, as well as meet their needs. Because at home, it's just traumatic. So. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick activity. This is just a little fun thing. This actually comes from Ruby Payne, and she's an author, and she's researched a lot of socioeconomic statuses. She has great books available if you're ever into getting into that. But this is just a fun little activity, and it's could you survive in wealth? Could you survive in middle class? And could you survive in poverty? They're really kind of funny to go through, and of course they're not real life, but it's just kind of interesting to see. So I'll kind of read them out just to. So we'll start with let's start with the wealth, and I'll just go through a couple because it's kind of fun just to see what some of these things in the wealth nobody knows. Can you read a menu in French, English, and another language? Let's see. Do you have a preferred financial advisor, legal service, designer, domestic employment service, and hairdresser? I want you to think about these as we go along and talk about them. Like, think about what's important to the certain classes. Like, if you're looking at wealth, these kind of things nobody in poverty is going to be even thinking about. So just think about that. You have at least 2 residents that are staffed and maintained. You know how to ensure confidentiality and loyalty from domestic staff. You have 2 or 3 screens that keep people who you don't wish to see you. You fly your own plane or company plane. You know how to enroll your children in preferred private schools. You know how to host parties that key people attend. You're on the board of charities. You know the hidden rules of the Junior League. You support or buy the work of a particular artist. Again, are people in poverty going to be looking at artwork or anything like that? I know how to read a corporate financial statement and analyze my own financial statements. So that's the wealth. In the middle class, these will probably fit me better. I know how to get my children into little league piano lessons and soccer. I know how to properly set a table. And again, like things like that, do you think people in poverty are going to be able to even care about setting a table? I know which stores are most likely to carry the clothing brands my family wears. My children know the best name brands in clothing. I know how to order in a nice restaurant. I know how to use a credit card, checking account, and savings account. And that's something to think about in poverty. A lot of people don't even have checking accounts. They pay everything by cash. And that can get into a real sticky situation because they pay in cash and then they don't have receipts, and it's just they don't keep track of money that way. You talk to your children about going to college. Let's see. You're able to help your children with homework and do not hesitate to call the school if you need additional information. And that's a big one right there that we'll talk about more. Because people in poverty, they may be working multiple jobs and they cannot help their children with homework. They don't have the education to help their children with homework. I repair items in my house almost immediately when they break. So then again, when you think about poverty, they have to prioritize their needs differently. So could you survive in poverty? I know churches and sections of town that have the best rummage sales. I know which rummage sales have bag sales and when. I know which grocery stores' garbage bins can be accessed for throwaway food. I know how to get someone out of jail. I know how to physically fight and defend myself physically. I know how to get a gun, even if I have a police record. I know how to keep my clothes from being stolen at the laundromat. I know what problems to look for in a used car. I know how to live without a checking account. I know how to live without electricity and a phone. I know how to use a knife as scissors. I can entertain a group of friends with personality in my stories. I know what to do if I don't have money to pay the bills. I know how to move in a half day, and that's a lot of these kids in poverty. They come home and they've been moved up because they've been evicted or something like that. I know how to get and use food stamps or an electronic card for benefits. I know where the free medical clinics are. I'm very good at trading and bartering, and I can get by without a car. So just think about the 3 different classes that we talked about, and of course they're not all the right things, or the right situations, but different priorities in different classes. People that are living in poverty, they don't care. They have to prioritize what they need the most at that time. Okay, so we're going to move on and get to the actual nitty-gritty and how this relates to you and kids in your classroom. So brain development. Okay, so the developing brain. A lot of people think that children are just born the way they are. And that can be some of the things, but they're also, children go and undergo a portion of their lives when they're little that their brain's developing. When they're born, even in the womb, they're developing and developing. So things that happen to them, traumatic events or being in poverty and things like that, are going to affect the way that they learn. And me being a diagnostician, this is really important to me because we see so many times kids are referred for special education when truly they don't honestly have a learning disability, or they don't have, emotional concern. And we'll talk more about that, about how that relates. But that's where the signs that we need to look for in the classroom. Is it a true disability, or is it where they're coming from? And how can we accommodate to meet the needs that they need? Okay, so a child's brain undergoes an amazing period of development from birth to 3, producing 700 new neural connections every second. So that's why, sing to your baby, read to your baby, even though they can't talk, like that's so big, the reading and things like that, to get them exposed to that language. In fact, 90% of children's critical brain development occurs by age 5. So that's just some basic facts that I didn't know. I know that when I was pregnant, people were telling me, you need to read to her, all the time. And now looking at that, like just what they're exposed to is going to help them later on in life. Okay, so this again goes back into the nature versus nurture. Are they born that way, or is it that it's the situation that they're in? So behavioral geneticists commonly claim that DNA accounts for only 30 to 50% of our behaviors. So 50 to 70% is explained by our environment. So that's a big difference there. So how we're born is not truly how you're going to behave, or yes, there are things that you're born with, like if you have a syndrome or a birth defect or that kind of thing. Those are going to be things that you can't help. But other things are, your environment can help you with that. This is really big here. The effects of the 9 months a child spends in utero are far negotiable, especially on IQ. So factors such as quality of prenatal care, exposure to toxins, and stress have a strong influence on the developing child. And that's huge that we see that. Kids that, or people that are in poverty, do you think that they have the means to get prenatal care? They may not know to take vitamins and things like that are going to help that. A lot of times we see, again, it's not always people in poverty, but a lot of times we see that exposed to drugs or alcohol that's going to affect the child's development. So just because the day that they're born doesn't start their development, it's going to be, their development starts prior to them being born. So rethinking the brain. The old way of thinking and the new way of thinking, we're going to talk about. So the brain develops depending on genes that you were born with. That's not always the case. The brain development hinges on a complex interplay between genes that you were born with and also experiences that you have. So those early experiences are going to help that developing brain. The old way of thinking, experiences that you have before age 3 have a limited impact on later development. So that's saying that things that you happen before 3 don't really affect you. But the new way of thinking is early experience have a decisive impact on the architecture of the brain and on the nature and extent of adult capacities. A secure relationship with a primary caregiver creates a favorable context for early development and learning. The new way of thinking is early interactions don't just create a context, they directly affect the way the brain is wired. So that's again like that nature versus nurture. Like if there's not a loving caregiver in the home when they're a baby, then they're going to have those abandonment issues, attachment issues, those kind of things. Those are going to cause an impact later on in life. The old way of thinking, brain development is linear. The brain's capacity to learn and change grows steadily as an infant. So it just, and we're gonna look at a graph about that's not how the brain develops. So the brain development is nonlinear. There are prime times for acquiring different kinds of knowledge and skills. A toddler's brain is much less active than a brain of a college student. So for those of you that have toddlers, which I know I do, she is learning and growing. And I mean, of course, when you're in college, but I just see her every day. She is 3. By the time children reach age 3, their brains are twice as active as those of adults. Activities levels drop during adolescence. And we see that they're experiencing all these things that they've never experienced before. So they're growing and growing and growing. The things that she comes home and knows and realizes, it's just like unbelievable that she's a sponge, soaking it in. They're just little sponges. So that they're going to be a product of their environment. If they're soaking in trauma and poverty, they're not going to be able to get those experiences. So we have to think about that when these kids walk through our classrooms. So this is a graph that talks about the human brain development. And you can see right here is the first year of life. And then we have actually in utero. So the sensory pathways, this is vision and hearing. Language is huge, and that's something we see all the time here in our district is, well, they're not talking. They're not, they have never been talked to. Well, is that truly a speech issue? Maybe, but it's because they have never been talked to. They don't know how to even speak. And then the higher cognitive functioning, that's going to go fit into like your IQs and different things like that. So this just shows that there are peaks here that we've got to hit and make sure that these, and this is the months, but the first year of life is critical. And then it does go down in years, but it just shows that you've got to be exposed to things to develop your brain. Okay, so this is kind of gets into it, and I have a handout for you, so I'm going to put it up here. But this is just a lot of, and I am no doctor, but this is a really good handout about poverty fact sheet. Let me see right here. So it's kind of one of those things, like if you remember the commercial back in the day that was like, here's an egg, and here's an egg on drugs, that kind of thing. So this is the brain, and we're going to talk about the child's brain on poverty. And so there's different, and again, like I said, I'm no doctor, but there's different parts of the brain that do different things. So the frontal lobe is the control center that manages the cognitive functioning. Of course, that's like your intellectual, your IQ, and that kind of thing. Planning, organizing, problem solving, paying attention, and impulse control. Do we see these things happen in our classrooms?
Yes.
Paying attention and impulse control? Okay, so the frontal lobe is what controls those things. The peripheral lobe is sensory information. It's important for understanding and interpreting sensory stimulations and aspects of visual attention. Well, visual attention, that's putting something on the board. Kids paying attention to that. If that's not fully developed, or if there's some kind of trauma that's taken place to that, they're not going to be able to visualize those things.
So it's beyond their control.
It's beyond their control. The hippocampus is central to learning, memory, and its stress response. Let me go down here. So the biggest part that we want to talk about is the gray matter, and we're going to analyze this. It's one of 2 major tissues in the brain. It's key for processing information and executing actions, and it makes the brain fire. Okay? So right here it says the brain grows fastest in the first 4 years of a child's life, and gray matter accounts for most of its growth. So again, the gray matter is what makes the brain fire, and that happens in the first 4 years of their life. The frontal and parietal lobes are among the last parts of the brain to develop, and they continue to develop throughout childhood. So I want you to read this right here. This prolonged period of growth makes them particularly vulnerable to environmental stress factors. And that's what we're going to talk about, environmental stress factors. So think back to that video that we saw at the beginning. Were there stress factors in that? So daily. So those kids are burnt. And then they come to school and are expected to learn these things. So it just talks about a recent study, and I'm not going to go through all this. You can take this home, but it's just it talks about that studies lower gray matter. Okay, so Children from poor and near poor households have significantly lower average overall frontal and parietal lobe volumes of gray matters than children from wealthier families. So there actually have been studies that have shown this, that truly children that come from low poverty or come from low income households have less gray matter. So why does it matter? Let's see. And I'm going to keep going through here. So it just kind of talks about, but this right here is where I wanted you to see. This figure shows a typical child's brain scan at birth, and that's the first column. So this is the typical brain scan at birth. This is at age 2, and this is at age 4. So it just shows the brain growth in, so one at birth, age 2, and age 4. So the last, the relative growth of gray matter just shows how much gray matter is growing each year. So y'all can look at that. Okay, the prefrontal cortexes and hippocampus, which are crucial for learning, cognition, and working memory, are the areas of the brain most affected by cortisol, the so-called stress hormone. So let's think about that and analyze that. Okay, learning, cognition, again, cognition is your IQ, how you process information, how you think, how you reason, and working memory are the areas most affected by cortisol, the so-called stress hormone. So think about a 4-year-old child. They come and they don't have food to eat. That's going to create stress. They see their parents fighting over money. They see, mom or dad going to jail trying to survive because they were robbing a bank. So many stress factors. And then they come to school and have to learn, but they have been affected because of all these things that have happened. These are just some more statistics. Students from low-income households face significant barriers that typically persist through their school years. Studies have shown that as these students enter adulthood, they typically earn less, have limited or no access to health care, and more likely to suffer from obesity and be at greater risk for homicide or violent assault. So again, this goes back into that generational poverty. This is what they know. It's just a vicious cycle. They don't know how to get out of it, and this is what creates these barriers. And then that goes into healthcare too. Like they probably don't have insurance, so then they get.
Or they don't know how to seek that.
They don't know how to seek, and that's a thing. I've done poverty simulations, and people don't know that there are resources out there, or even how to get those things. Or they might, if say it's a situational poverty, they might be embarrassed to go and seek out help. I know that the social worker tells a story about she was going to volunteer at CISC one time, and she saw this man that he just looked completely out of place. He was well dressed, and he was waiting in line to get food, and he had driven from somewhere, or he was working here because he had been laid off from his job, and he just had no idea what to do. He was trying to provide for his family, and he looked out of place, but at that point, that was what he had to do to provide for his family. 26% of children in the United States will experience or witness a traumatic event before they turn 4. And actually, I did some more research on that, and I found another study says that about 50% of students that you come into your classrooms have experienced some sort of trauma. And we'll talk about what those traumas are. But trauma changes the brain, and it makes things, there's been studies, and things that the way the brain changes makes it look like that they have ADHD, ADD, ODD, or autism. And again, that goes back into our special education. Is it truly a special education need, or is it just because that they've been exposed to something? So trauma changes the brain. It makes children aggressive, creates anxiety, defiance, withdrawal. So they have all these outside factors when they are outside of school, and then they come in and they're expected to sit here and learn and do this and this and this, or take a STAR test. And so that's the things that we have to think about. Young children exposed to 5 or more significant adverse experiences in the first 3 years of childhood face a 76% likelihood of having 1 or more delays in language, emotional, or brain development. So that's a huge statistic. So some environmental stressors, barriers, lack of resources, we talked about that, hunger, malnutrition. Kids cannot, we know that for a fact. I mean, just think about you if you're on a diet and you are starving. Can you think correctly?
No.
Or if you need your coffee,
Right.
or that kind of thing. Just, and these kids may not ever, like, especially on the weekends, if they don't have anything to eat, they come to school Monday morning and they're just starving.
Mhm.
They can't think. Your brain can't function properly.
And they don't get the proper nutrients either. It's not like a nutritional
Well, and
meal.
that's the thing. You think about how, you know I try to buy fruits and vegetables and how expensive they are.
Mhm.
And, you know, people they can't afford that. They have to pick, again, that goes into what they can prioritize. So it might just be frozen meals, or, you know, it's not a home cooked meal, or their parents are working and they're trying to provide as best as they can.
Mhm.
Shelter, again, we talked about that. That could just, not even not having a house, but not having the proper, you know, roof over them, or there's a hole in the floor, or it's cold in the winter. I know I've been to houses before that it's freezing in the winter. You can just feel it, or they're having to, they're using the heat from the stove. And then lack of parenting, that could be just a not knowing, or it could be that they're trying to provide and they're just not available, or there's an issue with going to jail or that kind of thing.
Sometimes you have grandparents they're taken over, and they're the ones that are caring for their
Yeah.
children. They're a lot older, and then
The times have changed too.
yeah, they've changed a lot.
I tell a story about I never, you know, this is going to my 6 years as a diagnostician, and before that I was a special ed teacher. But you know, doing this child fund thing, I've gone out to a lot of places, and I just had my baby so a few years ago, and I was still probably a little hormonal, and I went to we had to go visit a family at Motel 6, and you know, that's not the best hotel in town. And this mom was there, and she actually had a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and she could barely walk to the bus stop, and they were having to walk down, you know, 2 or 3 blocks, and she had a 10-month-old baby. And again, like I said, I just had a child, and this 10-month-old baby was crawling around on the floor, eating chips off the floor. And of course, again, I'm not trying to serve that child because they're not school-aged yet, but I'm immediately concerned about that child. And I asked her, I said, do you have formula? Do you have milk? Do you have the things that you need for her? She goes, no, he just eats hot dogs. Like,
A 9-month-old.
I mean, that's, you know, and to me, like,
Yeah.
I hardly feed my child 3-year-old hot dogs now. You know, first I'm thinking about choking her,
Yeah.
but she's just letting it survive.
Yeah.
I mean, they're in true survival mode.
Mhm.
Trauma, and again, back to that baby's 10-month-old, and they're living in a motel room.
That's what she's exposed to.
They're living in
Environmental.
yeah.
Mhm.
Loss of parent through divorce, incarceration, death. That's going to be trauma. You know, you see these kids, their parents are being pulled to go to prison. That's a lot of times we see that they don't have a dad, they don't have a mom. They're on drugs. They're in and out of wherever they're
They
at.
see that physical and
Yeah.
verbal aggression.
Abuse, physical, sexual, verbal. You know, there's a lot. I hate to see sexual, but a lot of times we see. Probably the worst is going to be verbal, because that's the most non-noticeable. You don't see the outward signs of it, but it's just, you know, parents might be getting drunk and they are yelling at the kids and telling them they're stupid and this and that. They get in trouble at school, and then for something that they can't control because they already have these issues, and they come home and they are getting yelled at and beat and different things like that. Domestic violence, and then of course homelessness. Is there anything else that you can think of on that? Okay, so this is another thing to think about. So again, like I've talked about, we have these kids that come to us. They've never been in school. They've only been at home with these parents that are in low income, and they've never been exposed to anything. So just think about the number of words a 3-year-old knows. Okay, so low income, 500. I know that 500 does seem like a lot, but when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, and you compare it to a professional working people, well, professional maybe is working class professional. Working class is probably those blue collar people, but you can just tell the difference. So you have this child.
Language, yeah.
You have this child coming into kindergarten. versus this child coming into kindergarten.
So the difference is a huge
Right,
difference.
so is this gonna be a special ed issue?
Well, it looks like a special ed issue because you're comparing it to that.
To this.
Professional.
Yeah. Okay, and then you think about to the opportunities, especially in our district. We have children that qualify for the GT program. We have children that qualify for the dual language program. Do you think that this child's gonna qualify or this child?
The professional.
So then you have this, they don't get that opportunity because they haven't been exposed to it. And then that cycle just
They
starts.
have limited
resources.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay, this real quick, I'm gonna go through this. This is something really neat that I saw, and it just talks about a child that was in foster care. And I'm just read this really quick because it's very small. But the other night I was having dinner with a friend sharing about my foster son. He had been hungry and homeless for the first 12 months of his life. Well, at least he was so young that he couldn't remember it, she said. That's what she said. The friend said that. I froze and had to contain my expression. The friend of mine is smart, but was so wrong. And I think this may be a common misconception. So that's a misconception of a lot of people, that they probably don't remember that. The truth is, the foster son of mine doesn't have memory of being hungry the first year of life, but yet his brain does. The brain builds and functions differently due to this trauma. Trauma included abuse and neglect. It includes to the daily decisions, anxiety, and the way he functions with other people because his brain is wired differently. That first 12 months of his life, he didn't get proper nutrition, so it's going to affect him later on, even though he can't verbally tell you that, but it's going to affect him. In this case, it's been years since the hunger, and he still won't stop eating to the point he will vomit. I've now seen this in a handful of our foster kids. The temporal lobes, which regulates emotions and receives input, are drastically altered. As seen in the picture, the brain on the left is a healthy and loved 3-year-old. So look at all this matter there. And the brain on the right is a 3-year-old who has been through trauma. So that's a research right there. I think we want to believe kids are resilient from trauma because it feels better to digest, but is there hope? There's always hope. I've seen kids change and blossom and rewire with the intention efforts of the parents' part. So it can happen. And that could be you.
If they're taken out of that.
Yes, if they're taken out of that environment. Will the full healing take place on the side of heaven? Maybe, but very possibly not. And it's always a much slower process than ever hoped. And the trauma's aftermath behaviors don't always add up or come out when expected. So it's important to take away that kids of trauma need healing. And I want you all to think about that. If you know that this child's coming to you that has a background of sexual abuse or verbal abuse or a parent incarcerated, you're going to have to give them extra nurturing, extra support.
And counseling.
Yeah.
School counseling.
You know, be aware of those situations, and we'll talk about that. They may not cry about their trauma, they may not talk about it, but they're going to have that trauma.
Just building that relationship.
So real quick, let's look at this one. I just want you to, these are two brains that both belong to 3-year-olds. Why do you think that one is so much bigger? I already showed you the answer, but. So they're both 3-year-olds.
Yeah, the exposure.
Yeah.
What they
So this is a normal 3-year-old, and this is extreme neglect. It's a big difference. So what does that make you?
Well, they come to us with what they have.
What you have?
And then we have to, every child is different. Every year may not be the same when we're in the classroom, when they come to us. So we have to adjust to their needs too and find what best to meet their needs.
You're their superheroes.
Yeah. Because that's
Those are
where they
safe
feel
place.
comfortable.
Right.
Yes.
So some specific things, and let's talk about these. Deepen staff understanding, and that's your job, maybe as administrators or lead teachers or anything. Make your staff aware of those things, aware that this is happening in our district.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, I know my mom is not an educator, not in school, she is so far removed for education, and she started working for CASA. And I remember her calling me one time, and she'd gone to visit her child, or her CASA kid at his school, and he wanted some ice cream, and he didn't have the money for it. And she didn't understand why that they wouldn't just give it to him. There's so many kids that don't have the money for it, and that's just the way it is, you know. She just was mind blown that that actually was taking place, you know. Embody respect, and I think that that's a big one too, because there comes a fine line with these parents, is it may not always be their fault. I mean, they might be trying to do the best that they can, but they don't have those resources. So you can't, sometimes they get offended if you overstate
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Embed those social skills, and that's just trying to help them, you know, realize that there isn't a bigger and better things out there, you know, to help them understand that they can do things to help their lives. Be inclusive, and that's, of course, just including everyone in the classroom. You know, don't exclude because
they didn't have the money
they
to
didn't
pay for
have it,
building.
right.
Yeah.
And that's something that I would, you know, recommend to always communicate with your administrators and things like that. If you notice, and you don't ever want to call them out in front of the whole class and make them feel like, oh, well, you're not going because you don't have the money, which I know nobody would do that. But, you know, it's just an important reminder to remember those kind of things. Recognize the signs, that is huge, you know. Think about that. Recently I was at a training, and we were talking about a child that would not sit down. And she would not sit down, and the kid kept saying, you know, well then push come to shove, and the bus driver let the teacher know that somehow the bus driver had found out that the child would beat on the bottom, and that's why that they would not sit down. So, you know, you're getting upset with them, and they're in trouble, but they're embarrassed to tell you. It's just a cycle. So, you know, use that compassion and understand. Alter the environment. That's, of course, is creating a safe place. You might be their only safe place that they have for the few hours a day that you have them. Then that's going to be their safe place. Empower students. Make them feel like they can do things. Build core skills, and that's just those skills, language, development, and provide hope and support. But the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this is that understand that these kids this is what they see at home. And they have to come to school, and I understand that's not an excuse for them, but we have to examine those outside factors and meet the needs of them where they're at. And if it does include counseling or social skills training or things like that, because they're not going to be able to sit down and do a worksheet or take a STAR test if they're hungry or if they have all these other things going on with them. So, do y'all have any questions about how that works? Well, you can always contact me. Like I said, if you feel, and again, I just want people to understand that, you know, there could be a special ed issue, but you know, look at the signs and things. And also, you're always more than willing, if you have somebody in your classroom. Tanya Akridge is a social worker. You know, she can help with providing clothes or assistance or anything like that. You know, I can get in touch with her.
All right.